South Africa will never know peace within its borders unless the rest of the continent has achieved peace and stability. This was one of South Africa's positions on foreign policy, particularly on the continent. But how successful has the country been in this mission? Welcome to Democracy 30. My name is Oliver Dixon. It's an absolute honor and privilege being in your company this evening. In this episode, we ask what has been the impact of South Africa's peace efforts on the African continent in the past 30 years. Joining us to reflect on this conversation is Sphiwe Dlamini, the spokesperson for the South African National Defence Force, Molly Dlamini from the Southern African Liaison Office, and Simon Handy, former United Nations advisor and peace negotiator in conflict zones, including Africa, the Caribbean, Americas, as well as the Middle East, amongst others. Before we delve into this issue, let's watch this insert produced by Johannes Tugwana.
He was even more impressive in our one-to-one discussions. And I leave the Congo myself with a very favorable impression.
We will go anywhere to find peace, be it Lusaka, be it any other location where peace for the Congo will be discussed.
Just 2 years after attaining democracy, South Africa was in the thick of one of the most brutal and perennial conflicts in the Great Lakes region, mediating between warring factions. The country's foreign policy on Africa since 1994 has been to create a peaceful, stable and developed continent. Since then, South Africa has been involved in mediating peace across various regions on the continent. The country started providing peacekeepers to the United Nations in 1999 when it joined the UN organization mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But this has come at a cost, resulting in some questioning whether the country shouldn't reconsider its position.
It is again under your watch, Minister, that 13 of our young soldiers have lost their lives in a foreign country without any legal backing or contractual basis.
According to reports, around 60 South African troops have lost their lives since the country's involvement in peacekeeping missions on the African continent. Domestically, concerns have been raised about the impact of inadequate financial support and military equipment. In the SADC region, while Zimbabwe was previously seen as the powerhouse in conflict mediation, the decline in its own political stability has resulted in most states looking to South Africa for moral and material leadership.
We have been part of peacekeeping missions all over the world. Now we support our Defence Force personnel who brave great dangers to make Africa a more peaceful and stable continent.
While some have called for South Africa to withdraw its troops and refocus the much-needed resources on resolving internal problems, others have warned that the country will never thrive while the rest of the continent remains in poverty and instability. Joe Tugwana, Democracy 30.
And welcome to the discussion. Mr. Dlamini, I want to start with you. In your view as the spokesperson of the South African National Defence Force in this conversation, has South Africa been effective in military peacekeeping efforts across the continent in the last 30 years?
I would not by any doubt say we have been successful. And I'll give you two most prominent peacekeeping missions that we've undertaken. The first one is Burundi. Without South Africa getting into Burundi, as per the instruction of the former President Mandela, when the world was watching and people were being killed in that country, we moved in, and it was the first peacekeeping mission that we undertook. And we were fairly new in that area. Lesotho, we went into Lesotho when the government there was removed. We restored order. And I can go on and on and on. Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, our members went to Côte d'Ivoire to quell the situation there from a political point of view and a mediation point of view. So I can safely say we've done pretty well.
Yeah. I want to ask you, Molly, the same question. And when we talk about a peacekeeping effort, there's a confluence of things that we do. It's not just a military intervention. It often is a interlocutory and mediatory effort as well. But in the instances where we have gotten involved, have we been largely successful? Let's call it a package deal of interventions.
Yeah, relatively speaking, we can say South Africa has been effective. We have case studies of the DRC, our intervention there, how the Congolese came to South Africa at the time for the talks, and that led to the democratic elections. And we have the case that Mr. Dlamini has spoken about right now, Burundi, where President Mandela played a role, and the presidents that followed thereafter, a very important role that ensured that those that were in the bushes were able to come out of the bushes and be part of the negotiations. So South Africa's special role is that it tries hard to be inclusive in its approach to ensure that everybody is taken on board and everybody participates. And we continue to see that we also continue to see the role that President Mbeki, for instance, played even after his term as a president in South Sudan, in Sudan. And yeah, so it continues, and we now see recently we offered venues for the talks from Ethiopia. So South Africa is also that safe space where people are able to come. Even those that are fighting, they are also sent to South Africa for their safety sometimes when these mediation processes are taking place.
Simon, I want to bring you into the conversation here. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your presence here as well. Has South Africa as an interlocutor on the continent been successful, by and large, within peacekeeping on the continent over the last 30 years?
I think it's a very complex question, but let me begin first by thanking you and thanking the panelists. I feel privileged to be added to this very important topic and a milestone. I think that can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. It just intermittently cuts there a little bit, but please do go again.
Oh, okay. No, what I intended to say was to first congratulate you for this seminal celebration. It's a milestone, 30 years of liberal democracy, so I feel privileged to join you. Now, when it comes to the questions of the effectiveness and the success of South Africa on the African stage, I think it's a much more complex questions that has to be put into context. There is no doubt that South Africa is a global and regional hegemon. The way in which it has played its card is also significant. I was myself I was myself a witness of how South Africa intervened in the Central African Republic, where they lost the soldiers. I was also privy of intervention in the DRC, in Burundi. So I think there's been a range of interventions that have actually demonstrated the ability of the country to project itself outside its border. And this celebrations also takes place now in the context of a very rich tapestry of international events, the UN General Assembly and its Pact of the Future, the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods institutions that have a significant impact in African countries, and more recently, the BRICS meeting in Kazan. And in all of that context, I think that our aim and our goal should always remain how we can work for an Africa that can sustain, govern, and support itself in the context of a global arena that has not always has its best interests at heart. We were not there at the beginning when the UN was set up in San Francisco. And right now, I think what South Africa is doing is really stepping up to the plate moving Africa from the menu to a seat at the table. And I think that by and large, that's the move that we're calling for. But I think South Africa can do more, can do better.
Yeah. Molly, South Africa has been accused by academics of often getting involved in regional conflict where the issues are resource-based and oftentimes take a side implicitly or explicitly that our peacekeeping efforts and interventions are never neutral, some academics have argued. Is that true? can our interventions, particularly military and intermediary interventions, be neutral by definition?
I think that the question of the morality of...
Sorry, Simon, that question was for Molly. I will give you a bite at that question in a very short while, but Molly, yeah.
Well, South Africa, compared to other countries, I would say South Africa has tried very hard to be neutral. And I think that's the reason why it is also a chosen nation by others, or a preferred nation by others to intervene. Whereas other countries are known for their approach where they do this peace building in order to be involved in the minerals extraction, and actually most of the time those are the reasons why we have the wars in the African continent. It's also because of those minerals, because these minerals are needed by other continents or by other countries. But South Africa has not, relatively speaking, it has been accused actually by others that it leaves too early and that it never comes back, because after building peace it leaves, and then others come to benefit, you know, from the peace dividends.
Yeah. Have we, Mr. Dlamini, been getting involved in conflicts on the continent and using our military might so that we could surreptitiously participate in the mineral extraction? Sudan, South Sudan, Mozambique being an example as well. Perhaps even the Congo, which is in itself a resource war that's ongoing.
I think, let me piggyback from what Sismole said. I think neutrality is key in any peacekeeping mission. The minute you are seen not to be neutral, there is no way you'll build confidence between the warring factions. And if you look at where we started with the Sun City discussions for the DRC, they came to South Africa because it's a neutral place. We've had Sudanese coming here because it's a neutral place. The issue around the Cote d'Ivoire, South Africa is a neutral country. By the way, if I may, we get requested to participate in those discussions around peace and security on the continent. We don't go there because we want to go there. So the neutrality is very key if we are to deal with these security matters. And therefore South Africa, in my view, has been neutral.
Where we've been found less than honest in terms of integrity in some interventions, Central African Republic being a good example of that, have we been able to rectify that after the fact? The reporting that came out half a decade to a decade ago was that South Africa was participating in the suppression of people in Central African Republic, to the extent that certain troops or certain military personnel were accused of raping women in those instances. Now, of course, disciplinary processes had effected after that, but have we corrected the path after that?
Look, I'm not affair with that accusation, particularly the one you're mentioning in Central African Republic. Let me give you a context. In Central Africa, we were there on the basis of bilateral with that country, right? And one of the things that we were doing in Central Africa was to train their military. They were here and we went there. And during that period, there were the other troops from other countries which were in the Central African Republic. So when that war erupted, we were caught in between there because we were very close to helping the Central African Republic's military to form a proper defense force. And we had to deal with that situation, which we found ourselves in.
Yeah. Look, I want us to speak about resource management when we talk about peacekeeping efforts. I can't imagine that it's a cheap exercise, and like Sismole says, oftentimes we're accused of leaving too early. I would assume that resource implications has a bearing on that action. But we'll delve into that question on the other side of this break. Don't go away. And welcome back to Democracy 30. Thank you so much for being with us. Tonight we asked the question, has South Africa been effective in peacekeeping on the continent, over the span of our democracy. Before we go back to the conversation, I want to bring you to this graph that gives you an indication of where South Africa has, over the last 30 years, gotten involved in peacekeeping on the continent. Lesotho, Burundi, and Uganda have been those examples we've spoken about, the DRC as well. But Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, and Ethiopia have been the lesser discussed examples. The Darfur and Sudan and South Sudan, consequently, have been embroiled in a great deal of instability, and the South African peacekeeping efforts have been involved over there. Mozambique, as well as Tanzania, has also benefited from South Africa's peacekeeping. The Central African Republic has been a hotbed of instability on the continent over the last decade or two, and that is an indication of where South Africa's gotten involved. Simon, I want to come to you here. How complex and expensive are peacekeeping efforts? Because it's not like you go in a couple of months, you're out. You often have to deploy your resources there for years, sometimes more than a decade. How complex and expensive, Simon, generally have peacekeeping efforts on the continent been?
Yeah, peacekeeping is really a complex and difficult endeavor in terms of, financial resources, but also troop contributing countries have to actually sacrifice their own troop and invest them in promoting peace and showing strength in the face of violence and tragedy. That's what we have called the responsibility to protect. But to cut really in a nutshell, when you look at the investment, for instance, right now, there's been 350 billion spent in Ukraine. If you convert that to what, in terms of, a significant development gain, what that could achieve in a fairly sizable country, there is no comparison. So the notion when it comes to peacekeeping is that peace is less expensive than war. And those who have actually challenged that assertion should continue to try war. So peacekeeping takes the commitment of a nation state to invest its resources and its troops. It takes also the responsibility of the host country to welcome that and to work in coordination in the context of an international community with other nations. So coordination, financial investment, military capacity. Only countries that really have the stamina and the resources can do it. And I think that that's what South Africa has done from the Congo to Burundi. It stood firm in promoting, that responsibility to serve against the background of its own internal structural vulnerability. But I think South Africa must continue to lead by example, embracing that responsibility to protect and support those who are in need of assistance in a very, very fragile international environment.
Yeah. Spear, I want to ask you this, and to take from the calculus Simon tells us there, is that it's a very simple calculus. Peace is cheaper than war. War's more expensive
than war.
Yeah, certainly. Where we've been involved, we've sought to bring about peace. And I think it's political economist Professor Patrick Bond, that makes the argument that there's a political and economic incentive for South Africa to get involved in peacekeeping missions, particularly if you look at countries like Mozambique and the DRC, because those are important trade partners to South Africa, and political stability in those countries and those markets matter, because the more unstable those countries are, the less the less economic activity exists between them, especially as resource-rich countries. How important is the economic consideration in peacekeeping efforts?
I think you've said a mouthful around juxtaposing peace and economic development. Without peace and stability and security, you cannot have economic development. And that's one of the key reasons why we get sent to these countries, to ensure that we contribute and bring about peace and stability for two main reasons, in my view. One, if there's peace and stability in these countries, there's economic development, there's trade amongst ourselves. We're talking about trade amongst the African countries. You'll get that. And South Africa, as one of the biggest economies in the continent, will be able to benefit from the peace dividends, because we'll be able to trade and develop our own economy and get more employment. Now, if there's chaos and insecurity, you cannot have that. And earlier you said, if we don't have peace around ourselves, then there's going to be a problem internally. And those are the things that are given consideration when we get sent to peacekeeping missions.
Yeah. Molly, how difficult is it to negotiate peace where it is resources, fundamentally, that has caused the war, instability, and division? I want to use Sudan, South Sudan, where ethnic tribalization and essentialization also played a role, but I also want to use Mozambique and the DRC as case study examples here. The DRC being the most complex, I would say, not just on the continent, but in the world. How do we have skilled enough negotiators, not just in South Africa, but across the continent, to negotiate peace where everybody wants to access the resources?
Oliver, I think we do have such, because what is important, part of the peace process should be in the issue of power sharing, the issue of sharing of the resources. Those are the things that should not be ignored, and that's the problem with other peace processes or other mediation processes. If they don't put those in the agenda and also ensure the inclusivity, then you'll find, then you'll continue to find others starting other wars or others creating other warring factions in order to, to continue if they feel excluded. So for me, I think the most important thing is understanding inclusivity. So South Africa, with its own experience of being a diverse nation with diverse cultures, it carries that with it, because we don't have those ethnic challenges, ethnic divisions that other countries, like you just mentioned, Sudan, the Nuers, and then you go to Rwanda, they also
and Burundi,
Rwanda and Burundi, but also within Rwanda, within a country, the two major tribes, the Hutus, the Tutsis. So we carry that, and that's something that we can be able to share with the warring factions. But what is more important is to make sure that the issues are in the agenda, because if you don't put the issues in the agenda, then the war will continue.
Yeah. Simon, do we have skilled interlocutors in the continent, in South Africa in particular, especially where the complexity of the division is so far-reaching, for instance, ethnic divisions, that we're able to successfully negotiate peace there?
Yes, let me first mention something, because I think before I respond to your questions, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think I will respond to your questions in terms of interlocutor, but I think there's something that is really important to mention, because the central question in this conversation has been if South Africa has been successful in its foreign interventions in terms of maintaining peace and projecting power to bring about a modicum of stability. I was in The Hague in January of this year to witness a momentous event. And I think that above everything that we have said in this conversation, the world will always remember that when silence prevailed, South Africa dared to stand for justice by presenting the case before the International Court of Justice, denouncing apartheid and genocide in Palestine. South Africa did not just champion the oppressed, but it cemented its legacy as a voice for the voiceless. And I speak from an outside perspective also as a political analyst. In time where others averted their eyes, the young democracy 30 years from Africa stood up, refused to ignore the cries for justice, becoming a beacon of hope. And this is a defining chapter in the nation's story, I think a legacy of courage and compassion that will inspire generations to come. I wanted to mention that because I think I speak with Molly directly coming out of the Hague and say what that represented for the continent in terms of its ascendance on the world stage as a force voice for the voiceless. So I wanted to mention that when it comes to interlocutors in the continent, I know we have a lot of difficulties. Our goals to help the continent, have a permanent seat at the Security Council, have a more respect on the international stage. But we Africans also have to stop being the geopolitical fiancé of everybody, going from one meeting to the other. And for that, it takes, principled leadership.
Yeah.
We have to stop hiring dumb, corrupt president, that will also recruiting and appointing dumb, corrupt politicians that do not have the best interests of the people at heart. And once we do that, then we can come again, have people at the table who are leading African nations in this second wave of independence that we are calling we are calling for. And I think there is a drive towards democracy. There is a foundation for democracy right now in South Africa. We need to continue to push and promote that. But I think that South Africa should continue to take its role more seriously.
I just want to pause you there because I have one more question that I just need to leave you. We have a very constrained fiscal environment in South Africa, very little resources. Many have said we shouldn't be spending money on peacekeeping on the continent. We should be spending that money locally. Do you have a sense of how much money we've been spending on peacekeeping, let's say in the last decade?
Simon, I would actually venture into a place where I would not want to state something that I'm not sure of, but I want to take from what our panelists there said. It's very expensive. There's no doubt about that. It's expensive in terms of resources. It's expensive in terms of human lives. So peacekeeping, it does not come cheap, but it's better to be in peacekeeping than in war.
Absolutely. We unfortunately have run out of time, so I am going to have to leave it there. Simon, thank you so much for your time. Molly, Swalespiwe, thank you so much for your time and your insights this evening. I really do appreciate it. Unfortunately, that's all we've had time for here on Democracy 30 in this week's installment. I'm back with you next week for another installment. If you missed this episode, you can watch it back on our YouTube channel. It is simply SABC News on YouTube, Democracy 30. My name is Oliver Dixon. It's good night for now. Cheers.